A warm welcome to all those in attendance, and thank you to the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and the Senate Human Rights Caucus for hosting this timely discussion on the U.S. government's efforts to prevent atrocities abroad and prospects for violence surrounding the forthcoming presidential election in Côte d'Ivoire. My name is Tomas Husted, and I am an analyst in African affairs at the Congressional Research Service, which provides nonpartisan research and policy analysis to the United States Congress. Before we begin, I would note that today's panelists do not speak on behalf of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission or the Senate Human Rights Caucus, and that members of the Commission and Caucus do not necessarily endorse all of the viewpoints that will be expressed in the discussion that follows. The Congressional Research Service also does not endorse any views or recommendations that may be offered. Congress has demonstrated an enduring interest in preventing atrocity crimes abroad. Today's discussion will partly center on the Trump administration's recently published second report to Congress on U.S. government efforts to prevent and respond to atrocities, a report that Congress required under the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act of 2018, which made it U.S. policy to identify, prevent, and respond to the causes of atrocities worldwide. Our panelists will discuss the findings of this report in detail and provide an overview of the tools that the U.S. government may use to detect early warning signs of mass atrocities and to prevent the emergence of atrocity crimes abroad. We will then turn to a discussion of Côte d'Ivoire and discuss the risk of large-scale violence during presidential elections, the first round of which is scheduled for this Saturday, October 31st. Côte d'Ivoire has faced rising political tensions and sporadic violence ahead of the polls. At least 30 have been killed and dozens more injured in intercommunal clashes and confrontations between state security personnel and opposition supporters since mid-August. Tensions stem in part from a dispute concerning the constitutionality of President Alassane Ouattara's decision to run for a third term following the death in July of his favored successor. With pressures mounting as Ouattara's top challengers have rejected the independence of the Electoral Commission and encouraged supporters to boycott the polls, some observers fear that rivalries within the political class could ignite volatile social and ethnic cleavages, reminiscent of Côte d'Ivoire's contested presidential election in 2010, which resulted in a violent standoff in which an estimated 3,000 people died. A return to large-scale violence or a protracted period of uncertainty could undermine the considerable economic and security gains that the country has made since President Ouattara's inauguration in 2011. Here to discuss the U.S. government's efforts to predict and prevent mass atrocities abroad and to assess the risks of large-scale violence surrounding Côte d'Ivoire's impending elections are Naomi Kiekeler, the director of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Wes Rist, the deputy executive director of the American Society of International Law, and Eric Aimé Semian, a lawyer and chairperson at the Ivorian Human Rights Observatory. Also joining us is Gilbert Martin from the East Africa Coordination Group at Amnesty International USA, who will interpret Eric's remarks from French to English. Each panelist will speak for 5 to 7 minutes, after which we will have time for question and answer. I would ask attendees to submit written questions through the WebEx Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of your screens. I will field your questions and pose them to our panelists. Naomi, if we can turn to you first. For those who may be unfamiliar, could you provide us with an overview of atrocity prevention, the background and process of predicting and averting mass atrocities?
Thank you so much, Tomas. And on behalf of the Simon Scott Center for the Prevention of Genocide at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, I'd like to thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and the Senate Human Rights Caucus for holding this timely hearing on the second Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act and on U.S. policy in relation to the prevention of mass atrocities around the world. When Congressman Lantos passed away, his friend Elie Wiesel said of Lantos, "Whenever he spoke, it was always for the victims. Victims of injustice, of forgetting, victims of diseases, victims of dictatorship and totalitarianism. Today, we're here to talk about how we can do better, how we can build a world where we do not have to talk of victims. The Simon Spratt Center is dedicated to stimulating timely global action to prevent genocide and to catalyze an international response when it occurs. We seek essentially to do for communities today being victimized by mass atrocities what was not done for Jewish communities before and during the Holocaust. Core to our beliefs is that genocide is preventable, and that, as the 2005 Bipartisan Genocide Prevention Task Force report noted, we have a duty to find the answer before the vow of never again is once again betrayed. So hence with your comment, Tomas, I want to start just by acknowledging that 70 years after the end of the Holocaust and the creation of the International Human Rights Regime, the creation of the Genocide Convention, we find ourselves in a very humbling position whereby this issue remains as live and germane as it did 70 years ago. Just before the COVID lockdown, I was in Cox's Bazar on a bearing witness trip with my colleague to speak with Rohingya survivors of genocide. And it was profoundly moving to hear them say that we are genocide survivors, but the world does not see us that way because the most powerful country in the world hasn't said genocide. So we struggle not only today to prevent the crimes from occurring even when the warning signs are glaring, but tragically we also struggle to actually use the names and invoke the crimes once they have actually occurred. If there's anything that we hope you take away from our testimony today, there's 3 key points. The first is that the prevention of genocide and related crimes against humanity is not a boutique issue. Rather, it's a central foreign policy priority. The ramifications of failing to prevent are felt not just by the affected communities, but they're felt globally. In the last 20 years, every president has had to confront the commission of genocide and large-scale crimes against humanity on their watch, from Rwanda to the former Yugoslavia to Darfur, Syria, Burma, Iraq, and China today. The second is that Congress has a critical role to play in ensuring continuity, consistency, and creativity in U.S. policy on atrocity prevention and enabling early preventive action. The passing of the Elie Wiesel Act in 2018 was a critical step in upholding this role. It is truly a bipartisan agenda, and what we hope to see going forward is more formal hearings before which government officials are asked to speak to the policies that they are enacting. And the third is that each of you who are watching, each of you who is a staffer, has a critical role to play. We know that leadership comes from each of you, and that is where we often see the impetus for life-saving action. The lesson of the Holocaust was that there are many arguments that can be made on why not to do something. The harder path is to argue on behalf of those who are facing the risk of atrocities and to show that it is possible to align interests in a way through which we are actually ensuring that our national security at its core takes seriously what the Elie Wiesel Act asks us to do to prevent atrocities. Very briefly, the modern conception around atrocity prevention was born out of the experience of the Holocaust, the human rights norms that are enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Genocide Convention codify them. What they don't tend to do, though, is explain what prevention means. We know that mass atrocity crimes are the most constant, shocking of crimes. They're large scale, they're deliberate acts that can constitute genocide, crimes against humanity, many war crimes, and one crime that isn't defined internationally, ethnic cleansing. In 2005, at the United Nations World Summit, every government and head of state acknowledged the moral, legal, and political imperative to give meaning to never again by committing to uphold the responsibility to protect populations from mass atrocities. They recognized that governments had a responsibility to prevent such crimes, and in those situations where governments are unable or unwilling to protect their population from atrocities, the international community has a responsibility to protect civilians. It's important to note that that regards all mass atrocities, not only genocide, the emblematic crime of all crimes. All mass atrocities merit preventive and protective action. R2P also starts from a place of humility, recognizing that every single country has grappled or faces a risk at some point in their history of atrocity crimes. And we see that even today as the U.S. is grappling and confronting a history of crimes against humanity in regards to slavery and the treatment of indigenous peoples. Now, when we talk about upholding a commitment to atrocity prevention, Strategies need to be developed to mitigate the risk of mass atrocities along a continuum from prevention to response to accountability. This includes undertaking actions that respond to unfolding atrocities where they occur and working to prevent new ones. Calibrated approaches often require a multi-pronged effort, employing a myriad of state and non-state actors at the local, domestic, regional, and international level to use non-coercive and coercive measures. And I'm sure Eric will speak to that in the discussion on Côte d'Ivoire. Atrocity prevention is a goal rather than a particular process or set of tools, and it can look different in different contexts. At its core, it requires greater attention to and policy engagement on the early warning signs and root causes of mass atrocity crimes, and a greater investment in risk analysis and assessment of policy options to address root causes and other factors that create an enabling environment for perpetrators while reducing capacities to dissuade them, interrupt their plans, and halt atrocities. The field is relatively new. We're constantly learning. We know that there are a number of short-term risk factors and long-term dynamics and triggers that, though on their own are not sufficient, are often necessary for atrocities to arise. We know that there are a range of tools that can be used: preventive diplomacy, peace messaging, condemnation, sanctions such as embargoes, travel bans, targeted economic sanctions, preventive deployment of peacekeepers or troops, accountability mechanisms, and in rare instances, military intervention, which is contrary to many of the misconceptions about our field. We don't need to build a new toolbox. There are not needs for expending significant financial outlays. Rather, what's needed is more timely, ongoing analysis of risk and conflict dynamics, smarter and more calibrated utilization of existing capacities, and a more thorough examination of the unintended consequences of both action and inaction. Just very, very briefly, I just want to acknowledge that in the United States, through the actions of President Obama and the Presidential Study Directive 10, the Atrocity Prevention Board was established. Today, we see the continuity of that work through the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force. And I know Wes is going to talk in much greater detail about the work of that and where we believe that there is a need to kind of invest further. We do want to acknowledge the important leadership that Congress has played. Had it not been the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocity Prevention Act, we would not have seen the elevation of the priority of this particular issue within Congress. And also an important role of Congress is to serve as an external source of accountability, to push for consistency, to push for creativity, but really to hold policymakers accountable. There are a number of relating legislation and agendas, and I'll just kind of wrap up by just highlighting the Women, Peace and Security Act, the Global Fragility Act, the focus on international religious freedom. It's important to acknowledge also that there are gaps, which is why the Elie Wiesel Genocide Prevention Act is so important. Not all states that experience atrocity crimes are fragile states. Not all communities that are vulnerable are religious minorities. We have to have a much more nuanced understanding of what atrocity risks are and what prevention is. And the passing of this act is really just the beginning. We would encourage each of you who are watching to, through your respective committees and through your members, to push for formal hearings on atrocity prevention. It's important to note that the U.S. is the only government that has got something like the Early Warning Task Force, the only government that has legislation like the Elie Wiesel Atrocity Prevention Act. So it is truly remarkable. What we need to see now is real implementation. We also need to ensure that there's appropriate funding to do this work, and Congress has a critical role to play in the Appropriations Act. It's important that Congress members use their voice, take bearing witness trips, create spaces for individuals like Eric to have their voices heard, but also to ensure that the next administration hits the ground running, and that irrespective of whether or not we see a continuity of the Trump administration or a new Biden administration, that at the center of their foreign policy lies a commitment to the prevention of the most heinous and conscience-shocking of crimes. Happy to talk in more detail about each of those points, but there's just a brief overview of the kind of origins. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that overview, Naomi. Wes, if we can turn to you here. Drawing on your work in the field of international human rights law, can you give us an overview of the Trump administration's second report to Congress pursuant to the Elie Wiesel act and, give us your assessment maybe of the administration's progress toward the goals laid out in this act and related legislation that Naomi was discussing.
Certainly, and thank you, Tomas, for taking the time to serve as our moderator and to coordinate all of this. I do wish to convey my thanks to Representatives McGovern and Smith and Senators Coons and Tillis for their support of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and the Senate Human Rights Caucus in taking up this important issue. I would like to note that I speak today not in my capacity as Deputy Executive Director of Wiesel, but in my role as the co-chair of the Elie Wiesel Implementation Committee of the Prevention and Protection Working Group, also known as PPWG. PPWG is the civil society, the collection of civil society organizations that interact with the U.S. government through the Atrocity Early Warning Task Force that Naomi mentioned, to provide input, to provide information, to provide connections, and to provide critique. And one of those things is the assessment of the report. Let me start by mentioning that the Elie Wiesel Act is a monumental step forward in the United States' efforts to fulfill its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. The United States initially signed the convention at its unveiling in 1948, but did not take the mandated step of establishing the federal crime of genocide until the Proxmire Act in 1988, 40 years later. Since that time, there had been no formal implementation of the convention's other major requirement, the obligation to prevent genocide. With the Elie Wiesel Act's passage in 2018 and entry into force in 2019, the United States has affirmatively committed itself to fulfilling that obligation. It's also important to note the hard work and passion of the United States career civil servants and military personnel who've been working for years and even decades to try and protect those at risk around the world. The Elie Wiesel Act serves to codify their efforts and the will of the American people, and to ensure that our political leadership takes seriously this commitment to the principle of never again. The creation of the government's Atrocity Early Warning Task Force is an important part of that commitment. Unfortunately, as Naomi noted, history is rife with examples since the Holocaust of times where the world has failed to prevent mass atrocity events. And there is no quick or easy answer to these challenges. As Naomi said, it requires nuance. PPWG reflects a broad collection of civil society organizations trying to provide the government with that nuance and to do everything possible to prevent, mitigate, and respond to mass atrocity events when they do occur. I'd like to take a few minutes to highlight some of the challenges we see in fulfilling that goal and that obligation. The full PPWG assessment of the government's report on their efforts is available on the briefing's webpage, as well as on the PPWG website. The first thing I'd flag, and I know that our government colleagues are actually working on this and in agreement with us on this, is that it is critical that the government assessment of ongoing atrocities that the government provide their list and their assessment of ongoing atrocities and the list of at-risk countries, and that it be made publicly available with the exceptions for classified materials kept as minimal as possible. Reporting on the response to ongoing atrocities is an essential part of the task force's obligations and represents the crux of accomplishing the Elie Wiesel Act's goals. And as Naomi mentioned, part of Congress's job in requiring this report is to serve as a external check and a evaluation of whether or not the administration is accomplishing these requirements of the Act. Second, the Act anticipates that the task force will undertake specific actions based on the analysis of risk and potential ongoing atrocity events that they have undertaken. In its efforts to engage with allies and partners around the world, including with international and regional organizations, the United States' role as a leader on atrocity prevention issues is based not just on the activities that it undertakes, but also the public statements it makes on these issues. For example, the continued lack of designating the actions of Myanmar against the Rohingya people since 2016 as a genocide represents a disconnect between this administration's actions and its stated intent to hold perpetrators of genocide and mass atrocities accountable. The effect of the U.S. Secretary of State standing in front of the seal of the United States and publicly declaring an action to be a mass atrocity, a crime against humanity, a war crime, or genocide has been significant over the decades. However, the process for making that determination and the decision to publicly announce that a determination has been made, as evidenced by the above example of Myanmar, and has been inconsistent. Using the resources of the interagency task force to assist in making this determination, as well as coordinating the whole of government response undertaken by the U.S. government, will greatly increase the effectiveness of U.S. atrocity prevention efforts. Third, the Act specifically calls for the United States to enhance multilateral mechanisms and strengthen relevant regional organizations that work towards atrocity prevention, transitional justice, and accountability. There is currently, and we believe will continue to be, a significant role for the United States to play as a singular actor on atrocity prevention issues globally. But there are significant opportunities to maximize the effects of U.S. actions by cooperating with allied countries and multilateral institutions. PPWG and its civil society members do, however, strongly condemn the use of visa restrictions and IEPA sanctions against Prosecutor Bensouda and Director Motochoko of the International Criminal Court. These sanctions are intended to punish individuals who are actively engaged in the commission of mass atrocities and instead are being used against international civil servants who are actively working to hold those same violators of international law to account. Finally, as we look forward to future challenges, it's important that we use the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic and the highly specific issues it has raised with regards to potential mass atrocity events, that we carefully consider and that the task force carefully consider the lessons we have learned from that. Events like the pandemic are instructive as to other aggravating global factors that might cause significant spikes in risk of atrocity events. These could be seasonal weather events, local elections, extended natural disasters, or even the looming impact of climate change. Exercising a forward-looking effort on these issues will position the task force to better respond and to ensure that U.S. government employees around the world are not caught unprepared when faced with these potentially unpredictable but entirely foreseeable events. I will end by conveying that PPWG and the broader civil society community sees our efforts to engage with the U.S. government, both through the task force and through Congress, as collaborative. We're not here to cast blame or fault. We firmly believe that the career civil servants, uniformed military personnel, and congressional representatives are all committed to the principle of never again. We stand here ready and willing to be your partners in helping ensure a world in which people no longer need to fear persecution or death because of who they are, what they believe, or where they were born. I'll finish there, Tomas, and be happy to answer any questions that folks might have.
Thanks very much, Wes. I certainly have questions for you, and I'm sure we'll have a lively Q&A discussion. So, Eric, if we could turn lastly to you, there's been rising concern about the potential for large-scale violence surrounding Côte d'Ivoire's upcoming elections. Can you give us an overview of the current situation in Côte d'Ivoire and the risks of a further deterioration in security conditions?
Hear me?
I can,
Hello?
yes.
Okay, sorry, but since the issue is very sensitive, I think I have to turn in French to make sure of what I'm going to say. So,
Understood.
I'm very sorry.
Gilbert, do we have you as well?
Indeed.
Perfect. Okay, great. Proceed, please.
Ok. Alors, il faut dire d'abord que c'est important de soulever ce genre de débat sur la prévention des atrocités et des crimes graves en Côte d'Ivoire. La Côte d'Ivoire a un lourd passé de violence électorale depuis les années 1995 et qui n'est pas encore résolu et qui principalement tourne autour des questions d'ordre électoral.
Excuse me if I pause quickly. So, Gilbert, are you able to? Are you going to be just proceeding after a certain time?
Yes, we'll be doing this in consecutive, Thomas, which means that he will say a sentence or two, and then I'll come in, and then we'll go that way.
Wonderful. Okay, sorry to ruin the routine. Please proceed.
Hello?
So the context that has to be explained is that Côte d'Ivoire has a heavy history which dates back to perhaps 1995 and which has yet to be resolved in terms of electoral violence. The essential point resides in the breakdown of the social contract, particularly the absence of a consensus, an electoral consensus in terms of organizing the elections. These disagreements in 1995 led to an active boycott of the elections and in turn resulted in many imprisonments, people that were wounded, as well as deaths.
Et au cours des élections de l'an 2000, de nombreux désaccords, notamment autour de l'organisation des élections, avaient également fait de nombreuses personnes tuées. Point besoin de rappeler, n'est-ce pas, tout le passif de la crise post-électorale de 2010, qui a fait au moins 3000 morts en Côte d'Ivoire et de nombreux blessés, au rang desquels on dénombrait des crimes contre l'humanité.
And in the year 2000, the disagreements concerning the organization of the elections also led to several deaths. No need to recall that in the 2010 context, more recently, there were up to 3,000 people killed and crimes against humanity were committed.
Et les violences électorales au fil des années ne bénéficient jamais de poursuites judiciaires appropriées et conduites de façon impartiale, ce qui fait que nous traînons un lourd passé, n'est-ce pas, d'atrocités, de crimes au regard du droit international qui sont commis et qui n'ont pas encore reçu de réponse appropriée jusqu'à présent.
And these electoral violences are never taken or pursued in a judicial context that's impartial and appropriate for the crimes, which means that we are accumulating this heavy past from year to year until now.
Les désaccords politiques naissent généralement autour de la mise en place de commissions électorales indépendantes à la faveur d'élections, autour, n'est-ce pas, de l'impartialité des cours constitutionnels, notamment le Conseil constitutionnel en Côte d'Ivoire, et les conditions d'éligibilité à la présidence de la République. Voilà. Alors, les dernières, notamment les conditions d'éligibilité, contiennent bien souvent des motifs d'exclusion de certains candidats à l'élection du président de la République.
These disagreements usually have to do with the setup of electoral commissions that are truly independent, the Constitutional Council, the conditions under which one can be eligible to run for the presidency of the Republic, and very often these are used to prevent people from running as opposed to being inclusive and encouraging candidates.
Alors, plus généralement, et bien en amont, ce qu'il faut dire, c'est que la Côte d'Ivoire n'est pas du tout un modèle de passage réussi à la démocratie autour des années 90 et suite au décès du président fondateur Houphouët-Boigny. L'absence de conférence nationale, l'absence de débat national sur la vie de la nation, ainsi que le conseiller le discours de la Gaule, et ainsi que le cadre consécutif à l'effondrement du mur de Berlin se prêtait. Donc, le problème, c'est que le virage de la démocratie a été raté en Côte d'Ivoire. Du coup, okay, go.
Merci. And in fact, we missed the turnoff to be able to successfully ensure a democratic transition. More generally, Côte d'Ivoire has failed to ensure democracy since 1990 and the death of our founding father, Houphouët-Boigny. The absence of the holding of a national conference or a national debate on the political health of the nation, as was suggested and encouraged by the La Boule speech or by the collapse of the Berlin Wall, has all led to these failures.
Et dès lors, il est apparu en Côte d'Ivoire, jusqu'à présent, des passations de charges, des passations de témoins du président par la force, avec pour conséquence la personnification du pouvoir d'État, la déstructuration progressive de l'État et de ses institutions au profit du développement d'individualité. En corollaire est aussi apparu le repli identitaire et religieux comme moyen de manipulation des masses pour tout rapporter, n'est-ce pas, à sa propre personne.
And so what we have seen instead is that the political process is one based on force and leading to, as a consequence, the personification of power itself, the actual dismantling of the increasing dismantling of the state and of its institutions to the benefit of individual personalities and individuals. As a corollary, it has also led to a falling back on a religious and communal identity as a means of manipulating the masses.
Vous me permettrez, Président, d'intervenir sur deux points précis. Le point précis du contexte autour des élections de 2020 et, n'est-ce pas, les risques attenant, n'est-ce pas, à ces élections-là. Donc, sur le premier point, il faut dire que le passif non clairement épuisé de 2010 et la fracture sociale et politique qui s'en sont suivies devraient déjà entrevoir l'atmosphère de tension actuelle. Donc, ce n'est pas surprenant. Tout observateur avisé sur la Côte d'Ivoire devrait savoir que le risque, n'est-ce pas, de déflagration, le risque, n'est-ce pas, que des atrocités soient commises, pesait déjà sur les élections de 2020 depuis plusieurs années.
Allow me now to move on to the situation currently in the elections of 2020. The fact that we did not deal with these issues back in 2010, that the social breakdown and the political breakdown took place, leads us to the atmosphere of political tension which we currently live in, which could lead to possible mass atrocities.
Les crimes au regard du droit international, la justice transitionnelle, l'approche centrée sur les victimes, etc., rien n'a été fait de 2010 jusqu'à présent. Au niveau des libertés publiques, on a assisté à des poursuites orientées uniquement vers un camp, voilà, et on a eu en fait un exercice disproportionné des libertés publiques entre 2010 et maintenant. Donc, il y a eu beaucoup de successions d'événements qui ont conduit à la situation que nous connaissons et qui sont des motifs de croire, n'est-ce pas, que l'atmosphère se prêterait à des violences.
What has happened since 2010 has resulted in the tensions of today that could lead towards the violences that we see. In terms of public freedoms, we've seen that there have been political, or rather judicial steps taken only against the opposing camp, the one that's that of the former president, as well as those who currently oppose the regime openly, that's in power today. These restrictions of freedom and the ability to demonstrate and freedom to express oneself is also something that we're seeing.
Un arrêt de la Cour africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples en date du 18 novembre 2016 condamnait déjà l'État ivoirien à réformer sa commission électorale indépendante suite à une saisine. Malgré une bonne volonté apparente affichée par les autorités, la réforme de la commission électorale indépendante n'est pas allée jusqu'à son terme tel que recommandé par la Cour africaine. Résultat, les principaux partis d'opposition aujourd'hui contestent cette commission électorale. Les membres de l'opposition contestent cette commission électorale mise en place par le pouvoir en place et qui est composée en majorité de membres du pouvoir en place en Côte d'Ivoire.
In terms of the elections, the judgment by the African Court of Human and People's Rights that was handed down on the 18th of November 2016 and which required that the Ivorian state reform its electoral commission has not been applied, despite the goodwill that has been present. The Ivorian authorities have not gone to the logical conclusion of such a reform. The result is that the main opposition parties today are contesting the validity of this electoral commission, which is essentially made up of party members of the governing party that's in place currently.
Maybe I should move forward due to time concerns with three points, and then you will translate, right?
Okay.
OK. Et donc, l'actuel président avait renoncé à se présenter aux élections de 2020, puisque la Constitution ne lui permettait pas de toute façon. Ensuite, son dauphin est décédé en juillet 2020, ce qui l'a emmené, n'est-ce pas, à revenir sur sa position. Ceci est le point d'achoppement, en fait, de la crise que nous connaissons, c'est-à-dire le retour dans l'arène politique du président de la République, alors qu'il avait renoncé à concourir. Dans sa conception, le choix de son dauphin décédé l'oblige à revenir, alors que du point de vue de nombreux observateurs ivoiriens, c'est un choix personnel qui ne regarde que le président et son parti et qui ne devrait pas être imposé à la Côte d'Ivoire tout entière. Donc, le décès de quelqu'un ne devrait pas être la base, n'est pas bien un revirement. Alors, le Conseil constitutionnel est aussi composé de membres dont la neutralité est contestée. À preuve, il a rejeté les candidatures de la plupart des membres de l'opposition significative en Côte d'Ivoire.
The current president had, in fact, announced that he was not going to present himself for another term, and in fact changed his mind once his chosen successor died in July 2020, and this within a few months of the upcoming elections. This is purely a personal decision which should not concern the Ivoirian people overall. And yet his term is his second one now, and it would be his third term, and that has been considered to be an affront to the constitutional provisions. The Electoral Commission that has been set up and is overseeing these current elections is perceived once again as being one that is stacked with party militants or party activists from the ruling party.
C'est donc dans ce contexte tendu et de contestation qu'on évolue à présent. D'un côté, on a le pouvoir d'État qui maintient que le contexte électoral est bon, la commission électorale est bonne, le conseil continue est bon et que la date des élections va se tenir. Et de l'autre, on a une opposition qui conteste, n'est-ce pas, les institutions électorales, qui estime qu'elles ne sont pas impartiales et qui a donc appelé à la désobéissance civile. Ce premier point fini, je vais maintenant en arriver aux violences électorales et à ce que le Congrès américain pourrait faire.
So this is the context we find ourselves in now, where we have a contested situation currently with the possibility of violence following the decision by the president to present himself for a third term, and the opposition that has called for a civil disobedience, an active civil disobedience, which they see as being in response to the president's decision. Now let me move on to the violences that we could see for this 2020 election and what Congress could possibly do in terms of that.
Nous sommes déjà à plus de 30 personnes tuées et plusieurs dizaines de personnes blessées, dont certaines dans un état critique, dans les localités de Dabou, de Bongouanou, de Bonois, d'Adzopé, etc. Il faut, n'est-ce pas, soit les membres de l'opposition et les supporters du pouvoir en place, ou soit les membres de l'opposition et l'armée régulière ivoirienne.
We're currently in a situation where we have well over 30 people already killed in towns like Bongouana, in Divo, in Bonois, in Adzope, and other places, and these are often due to confrontation between party activists on the one hand, and also in terms of military activity against opposition on the other hand.
C'est malheureusement des affrontements communautaires qui ressurgissent, où en fait la base, n'est-ce pas, qui pousse les gens à attaquer, c'est soit l'appartenance politique, ou soit l'appartenance ethnique, ou encore soit l'appartenance religieuse. Pour la simple raison que les acteurs politiques utilisent encore des manipulations pour leur faire croire que soit il faut parvenir au pouvoir d'État pour maintenir les acquis de la communauté, ou soit il faut rester au pouvoir pour maintenir les acquis de la communauté.
What we're seeing is a fallback on the politics of identity and even religion, and what is being presented to the people is the idea that we need to either hold on to power to be able to hold on to what you have been able to achieve and obtain yourself, or that we have to take power to be able to do it ourselves.
On retiendra donc une grande manipulation de l'information, une grande manipulation du fonctionnement de l'État, une manipulation dans les mots d'ordre politique lancés pour amener, n'est-ce pas, les entre elles et pour amener, n'est-ce pas, les forces de défense et de sécurité à s'en prendre à certaines populations typiquement identifiées.
We're seeing a lot of disinformation, we're seeing a lot of manipulation, we're seeing a lot of falsities being told to be able to manipulate the people and to end up having the security forces go after the opposition and the demonstrators.
Ceci intervient dans un environnement où les manifestations publiques sont interdites, dans un environnement où il y a encore des détenus politiques, dans un environnement où, n'est-ce pas, toutes les manifestations ne sont pas autorisées.
We are in an environment now where there are indeed demonstrations that are not being allowed, where people are not able to express themselves, where they are not able to participate fully and freely.
Eric, if I may pause you and ask maybe if you could wrap up with some potential actions for the U.S. government, and maybe we can leave some of the discussion to question and answer. But if you could wrap up briefly with some actions for the U.S., the United States government.
Qu'est-ce que devrait faire le gouvernement américain?
I'm reaching my last point. Alors, la médiation de la CEDEAO, l'organisation régionale de la CEDEAO de l'Union africaine n'ont pas apporté les réponses escomptées et les violences continuent.
I'm getting to that point. Thank you. And I'm saying that the mediations of ECOWAS and of the African Union have not led to the hoped for results so far.
Ce que le Congrès américain devrait encourager, c'est, n'est-ce pas, conseiller aux acteurs politiques ivoiriens et surtout aux organisations régionales et sous-régionales, c'est-à-dire la CEDEAO et l'Union africaine, de privilégier un dialogue franc, sincère entre les acteurs politiques ivoiriens pour calmer les jeux et mettre bas à terre. Il ne sert à rien à aller à des élections qui, au final, vont nous apporter, n'est-ce pas, de la violence et des crimes de masse.
What the U.S. Congress can do is to encourage not only the political actors in our country in Côte d'Ivoire, but also those on the regional and sub-regional level, and that is ECOWAS, that is the African Union, among others, to institute and pursue a political dialogue. There's no point in having an election which will just lead to further tensions and to violence.
La position officielle des États-Unis d'Amérique actuellement dans la tension ivoirienne, c'est une position de non-ingérence dans les affaires ivoiriennes. Je suis désolé, mais dans une situation où nous allons tout droit des atrocités, les États-Unis ne peuvent pas dire, n'est-ce pas, qu'elles sont dans une position de neutralité, alors qu'il y a 10 ans en arrière, la position des États-Unis était claire, n'est-ce pas, d'aller dans le sens du respect de la démocratie.
The position of the United States is one of non-interference in the politics and the life of a sovereign country, and how can we say that at a time where we're hitting the wall? Back in 2010, the United States did take a clear position on these issues. Why would we not do so again?
Pour finir, je pense que les membres du Congrès américain devraient questionner le gouvernement américain, notamment l'administration dirigée par M. Trump, sur ce que les États-Unis font de concert avec les Nations Unies, les organisations et avec les acteurs politiques ukrainiens pour prévenir, n'est-ce pas, ces violences, parce que nous constatons une attitude trop attentive. Donc, je pense que les membres du Congrès, en tant que des élus du peuple, doivent questionner le gouvernement américain.
I think the U.S. Congress, its members need to be asking of the Trump administration, what is it doing to prevent this move towards increased violence and towards possible atrocities? And what is it doing in the context of the international organizations such as the United Nations, the regional and sub-regional entities such as the African Union and ECOWAS, to be able to put pressure on and to help the politicians in Côte d'Ivoire to find a proper solution?
I think I will stop here because anyway you have my presentation and I'm ready for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Eric. That was fascinating, and I'm sorry to cut you short, but unfortunately, fortunately, we're leaving time for questions. So, but thank you so much. That was a comprehensive view, and I think really shows us the current situation in Côte d'Ivoire. So we have a few questions. Naomi and Wes, to bring you back in here, we had one question about the definition of genocide, and I might extend it to also ask, perhaps Naomi can give us that overview. You would discuss sort of the different definitions of atrocity crimes that we're discussing, and then Wes, I'd like to draw you out. I understand that that one primary complaint of the Prevention and Protection Working Group, or critique of the recent report of the Trump administration to Congress, was that, as you mentioned, there was no sort of direct identification of current atrocity crimes that are unfolding or countries that are currently at risk of such crimes. And so, if you might want, give us kind of your view on that, and if there's anything you might add in that regard. So, Naomi, if we could go to you first.
Sure, just very quickly. So the Genocide Convention in Article 2 outlines what the definition of genocide is, and what it means is any of the following acts committed with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, Those acts are killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. Really important to underscore that what distinguishes in part genocide from, for example, crimes against humanity is the intent to destroy in whole or in part. And the U.S. also has its own analysis around what that means in terms of in whole or in part. So again, really core to genocide, which makes it somewhat distinct, is that intent question, which also is at the crux of a lot of the challenges that Wes was alluding to and that I referenced in terms of actually making genocide determinations.
And then Wes, if you want to hop in with sort of your critique of the most recent report.
Yeah, and to build on what you flagged there, Tomas, in terms of the publicly announcing list. And look, we get this is a very complicated issue. There are a lot of diplomatic and political elements in play here, and certainly we understand that it doesn't make a job easier on an ambassador or a country staff officer if all of a sudden they're handling things from a country that says, what are you saying? We're at risk of a mass atrocity. Why would you say that publicly? Why do you think you know better than us? This is complicated. But we've also seen this be done effectively by the U.S. government in a host of other places. For example, things like the trafficking report, trafficking persons report, the nuclear nonproliferation report, the annual human rights report the State Department put together. These are challenging things. They do have to be negotiated, but they can be negotiated. And I will say that, in conversations with and working with our colleagues in government, we know that they want to be able to do this too. They see the value in this. There's a lot to maneuver on this. We recognize that some of the information that tells us that a country might be at risk of this may come from the intelligence community and therefore cannot be publicly released. That's why the Act allows for a classified appendix. But we do want to emphasize that should be as small as possible. And just because some elements of it need to be put in the classified appendix doesn't mean that the public portion should not be put out there. I would emphasize even more, Tomas, it's more critical that where the entire world recognizes that there is an ongoing genocide, like the example of Myanmar, that the United States actually take a leadership role there and recognize that. Our colleagues over at Refugees International have a Call It Genocide campaign going that you can check out. But there's a critical element of leadership requirement there that if we are going to be taken seriously in acting on these as our policy objectives, we need to be speaking this truth as well. It cannot just be behind the scenes.
Thanks, Wes. Eric, if we can turn back to you, I'm wondering of your expectation for the coming days. We have a vote on Saturday. It looks like Alassane Ouattara plans to move ahead with the vote, and that the opposition will, the major opposition parties will boycott. As an analyst, as an Ivorian on the ground, do you expect significant civil unrest on the day of the election in the coming weeks? Is there anything, any insight you could provide?
Yes, I got your point. Unfortunately, I'm scared and worried to think that we are going straight to a violent situation. As for me, it is still time for the U.S., for the international community, to speak clearly to the Ivorian authorities, specifically to President Ouattara, to ask him, to create a dialogue environment, to invite all the key political actors, all the key stakeholders for a discussion, for a dialogue, for a national dialogue. The most important is not the election. We did it in 2000 and in 2010. What was the outcome? Nothing, violence, crimes against humanity. We have cases at the ICC, and ICC was not able, to give redress and satisfaction to the population. We have to deal it internally. We have to deal with it internally. And as such, I think it's still time for the U.S. Congress, for France, for the UN to speak to the Ivorian authorities for a national dialogue in Côte d'Ivoire. It's still time for me to postpone this election. Understand? Because the significant opposition is going to boycott the election. What will be the result? Nothing. This is my point.
Thomas,
great.
Just kind of build also on some of the comments that Eric was making. I mean, when we look at the situation in Côte d'Ivoire and we talk about prevention, in a way, I think what we're looking at is a failed example of prevention right now. You know, I think it's important to underscore when I was talking about the tools available from an atrocity prevention toolbox perspective, in 2010, there was a resort to essentially military intervention to remove Gbagbo from the position that he was in part because of at that point already, over 1,000 people who had been killed, the existence of mass graves. We saw a rapid escalation in the types of tools that the UN peacekeeping mission, the French Licorne troops, and others had to put in place at that time. We've had a decade to try to address the issues that Eric has mentioned. And what I fear is that the approach from the international community has been one of just hope for the best. And what we need to always be doing from an atrocity prevention perspective is you can hope for the best, but you need to plan for the worst. And I think that goes a little bit to the comment that Wes was making around, is there a tension? How do ambassadors and embassies in country perceive risks? What does their risk assessment process look like? What are they reporting back to DC? But also, what is the receptivity to having the conversation around atrocity prevention? And sometimes you find ambassadors that are open to that, and that a public list or an acknowledgement publicly in advance that there's a perception that a country has a risk, or even as Eric is asking for, messaging in a more proximate way before a vulnerable moment like an election, can have a significant constructive impact in a particular country. But we're not seeing the level of continuity that is needed. And after a decade from 2010 to today, I think there needs to be a really sincere stock-taking of what efforts have been taken, especially at the regional and international level, to support local civil society and local actors that are trying to address the root causes and trying to, as Eric is doing and many of his colleagues are doing, to avert the worst possible outcome from happening. As he mentioned, the ICC alone is not a sufficient response from the international community.
Thanks so much, Naomi. Wes, if we can turn it back to you on this issue that Naomi mentioned of local actors. In view of the report, in view of the PPWG's assessment of the report, and as a practitioner, how do you see, what possibilities do you see in the United States government working closer with local civil society actors in countries at risk of mass atrocities or countries experiencing mass atrocities to sort of better integrate, the U.S. government's responses as well as those with that are already taking place on the ground?
Yeah, and I will say, especially organizations like USAID, government agencies like USAID, deserve credit for engaging with local civil society actors and working alongside them, finding ways to bring them in. The U.S. government has progressively been getting better at that. That's not to say that we're good at it. We've just been getting better. So there's always more that we can be doing on that front. We did highlight in the assessment a significant area of concern for us is monitoring and taking affirmative steps to protect the security of the local community actors that the U.S. government engages with. Many of them are significantly at risk already just because of the positions that they are taking in light of the fact that there is a risk for an atrocity event or an ongoing atrocity event happening in their country or their region. But if they start working with the United States on this, it may put them further at risk. And so the U.S. bears an obligation to, if you think of it in this way, to first do no harm, to make sure that we are not making things worse by our interactions. However, the insight and the awareness and the wisdom that those local actors bring to a nuanced approach to atrocity prevention is invaluable. And the U.S. government has recognized this, has incorporated it into some of their specific strategies. And I'm pleased to say, through PPWG and other similar organizations, has actually actively been soliciting their input, whether directly or indirectly, in order to provide for security. So PPWG provides regular country reports to the task force on countries where we have people on the ground doing this work. Some of them are actually the members of PPWG themselves. Some of it is people that those members work with, who they pass along information, they pass along concerns, they pass along areas that we flag. And in the last few weeks and months, we've had those briefings with our colleagues in government to highlight these issues. So I think there is a channel there. We need to do more. And I would build on Naomi's point about it's so critical that the in-country U.S. government staff, especially at the ambassadorial level and on down, make this a priority. Recognize that the Elie Wiesel Act specifically designates this not as just a thing the United States does because it's in line with our values, which we should be doing, but because it is a national security interest of the United States and because it does represent a critical concern, and that they can set an example for that by engaging with local civil society actors.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question from the audience here. I would also flag, given the number of questions we've received, we are going to go over by about 10 minutes to 12:10, and then we have a hard stop from our panelists. So if our audience can stick with us for another 10 minutes, that would be great. And thank you very much to our panelists for agreeing to stick around. Another question from the audience here. What and maybe for Naomi, we can get you back in here. What can American civil society actors and advocates do to assure that the U.S. government upholds its obligations under the Elie Wiesel Genocide and Atrocities Prevention Act? And if I could take the speakers, the moderator's prerogative, I might also ask, what can Congress do to perhaps better oversee these efforts? Naomi?
Thanks so much for that. I mean, I think it's really important for average Americans to express to their members of Congress their support for atrocity prevention and for making never again real. There's been remarkable leadership from within Congress on advancing this. And I think in particular, it's important to acknowledge the hard work that Senator Cardin and his team undertook. Senator Young, Menendez, Corker, Coons, Risch, Udall, Shaheen, Rubio, Wagner, Engel, Royce, and Schakowsky in the House, and actually, engage those members in ensuring that there is continuity of discussion about the implementation of the Elie Wiesel Act. Wes kind of outlined a few areas where we collectively feel that there needs to be greater focus. There have been briefings to members and to staff. I think we feel that it's really important that there is regular hearings and that there is a spotlight and attention placed and a forum by which you have to mobilize a whole of government response instead of answers. It sounds simple and like a small thing, but it's actually quite significant to have a hearing that then forces various parts of the U.S. government to actually have internal conversations and assess what they've been doing or haven't been doing. If we don't do that type of follow-up, if there aren't the letters that are sent asking the various departments what they're doing, it's quite easy for this just to become one of many kind of pro forma reporting requirements that is undertaken. And we want to really ensure that this gets the level of attention and seriousness that it merits I also think that it's really important as we come through and we engage in an election period where, irrespective of what the outcome is, there will be a degree of transition, that engaged civil society supports the work that PPWG has been undertaking in trying to articulate what the administration that comes into office in January needs to do, and that they can truly hit the ground running. This shouldn't be something where we have to be doing in-depth trainings to explain what atrocity prevention means. Of course, as civil society organizations, all of us will do that, but there are resources out there. And I think that one of the things that would be really important to do is to ensure that there is direct engagement and training for all new members of Congress on the Elie Wiesel Act, on atrocity prevention, and on how they can use their time in Congress and staffers' time in Congress to make a difference. And again, I just want to underscore that, members are the face of what at the end of the day is passed. Staffers are those who actually do the dogged work day after day, year after year, to actually get this legislation passed and to get the types of letters urging calm, resolutions, as there is right now on Côte d'Ivoire, passed. We can't in any way kind of underscore how important it is, for example, for the people in Côte d'Ivoire to see that members of Congress are expressing their concern about the election. It becomes all the more important that they do that when administrations don't, when there is silence. As Eric said, why in 2010 was there a vocal and engaged U.S. government, yet today there seems to be not as much of a robust engagement? Congress can step into that gap and really should be focusing and working alongside. So I just want to, again, kind of underscore the important role that individual staffers have in really helping to enact life-saving policies and tactical responses that can have a really profound impact on the ground for people.
Great. Thank you, Naomi. And with our last 5 or so minutes, Eric, I want to end with you. You, in your remarks, you discussed decades of Ivorian history, and you concluded that today and Saturday is really a culmination of a process of political tension and of rivalries. How can the United States and other donors better engage in Côte d'Ivoire, and what sort of assistance programs or other forms of attention could the United States provide that would help prevent this sort of situation from occurring again in a few years when the country returns to elections?
Oui, merci. Je pense que jusqu'à présent, la réaction des États-Unis, de la communauté internationale sur ce qui se passe en Côte d'Ivoire a été timide jusque-là.
Thank you very much. I think that Thank you very much. I think that so far the reaction of the United States, of the international community, has been too timid and not sufficient.
Et avoir de près les positions du département d'État, de l'ambassade de Côte d'Ivoire, des États-Unis en Côte d'Ivoire, on a l'impression que les États-Unis ne veulent pas se mêler. Quant aux autres donneurs, je veux dire, on assiste à une espèce d'hypocrisie. C'est un peu comme si, quand on est en face de la société civile et d'autres acteurs, on s'inquiète, mais en même temps, devant le gouvernement, on donne des appuis et on se mobilise déjà pour les élections du 31 octobre.
I think that when you look closely at what the State Department and perhaps the U.S. Embassy in Abidjan are doing, they seem to have a hands-off policy. And as far as some of the other major actors on the international scene, it seems that when they're talking to civil society, to the NGOs, they have one level of discourse, and then when they talk to the government, it's another, and they seem to be very supportive and moving on with the elections.
La plupart des missions d'observation électorale qui proviennent de donneurs Par exemple, la mission de Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa, EISA, la mission du National Democratic Institute qu'ils ont mise en place et qui est appelée NGO, ont déjà tiré la sonnette d'alarme pour dire attention, on va à des élections certes, mais les risques de violence sont grands. Beaucoup d'observateurs internationaux sont dans le même constat.
Some of the observers of the elections that are on the ground, such as Sustainable Democracy, such as the NDI entity that's present on the ground right now, are saying, careful, we're proceeding with the elections, yes, but this could lead to greater dangers.
J'espère que ce débat que nous venons de mener aura bien servi à quelque chose. Et j'espère que tout ce que nous avons dit atteindra bel et bien les membres du Sénat et du Congrès. Et j'espère que, comme nous l'avons recommandé, les autorités américaines seront sensibilisées sur les risques réels de crimes graves, les risques réels d'atrocités en Côte d'Ivoire, les risques réels de déflagration communautaire entre acteurs ivoiriens. C'est maintenant qu'il faut agir et ne pas attendre demain pour venir jouer les pompiers.
I very much hope that this debate that we've had today is going to be a useful thing for being able to convey to the American authorities what's at stake and the positive role that they should be playing. It's not later, after there have been crimes against humanity, after there have been atrocities committed, after the country has imploded, that they should come and try to act as firemen and put out the fire.
Pour un pays à risque comme la Côte d'Ivoire, nous pensons plutôt que la mobilisation devrait être de mise. Nous pensons que la mobilisation devrait être de mise. Ce n'est pas après qu'il faudra venir envoyer des experts, des commissions d'enquête, mais ça, pour venir procéder à des décomptes macabres en Côte d'Ivoire. Ça sera vraiment trop tard. Vous avez vu aujourd'hui l'intervention de l'ancien président Gbagbo. Il a parlé pour la première fois. Il a dit qu'il sera lié à l'opposition et qu'il n'était pas du côté de l'opposition. Il a estimé qu'après le 31 octobre, ça sera la catastrophe.
You should not be waiting towards after the elections and then send all your experts and all your committees to do the post-mortem, because it will be very macabre what they're going to be there to study. We should be dealing with Côte d'Ivoire now as a present-day issue now to prevent the problems from happening. You saw that President Gbagbo took to the microphones for the first time in a long time to talk about the importance of getting the political actors together and trying to not wait until things head south badly after the 31st.
Pour finir, my last point. Je pense que la Côte d'Ivoire n'a pas donné assez de signaux négatifs et dangereux de commission de crimes internationaux en matière de génocide, en matière de crimes contre l'humanité, pour que la communauté internationale soit encore dans une posture timide. C'est un cri de cœur que je lance au nom de tous mes concitoyens, au nom de toute la classe politique, pour que les États-Unis agissent, pour que le Congrès prenne cette affaire à bras le corps, pour que le gouvernement américain change de discours et qu'il parle clairement comme il l'a fait en 2010. Sinon, on va multiplier ce genre de panels, mais il n'y aura rien.
And I send to you an appeal from the bottom of my heart that we need to act now, that we need to have the United States be as present in the situation as they were back in 2010, that it is not after the events will have taken place that it would be useful to then send all your people over and do a postmortem then. It is something that I pray that you, and I ask for all the people that I'm representing, all the people from Côte d'Ivoire, all the people from the political class. It is now that we need the U.S. Congress and the U.S. administration to be paying attention to the situation today.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. And with that, I think we will close. I want to thank all of our panelists today. I want to thank again the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and the Senate Human Rights Caucus. And I want to thank all of our guests on the line for your great questions and for your attention today. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.